știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce-nseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Утреннего в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 22nd of August 2025, and we come to you tonight with an explanatory episode, I think is the best way to put it. And the explanation that we are going to engage in tonight is, of course, the explanation for what was really going on with the events that have become known as the Prague Spring of 1968, and the mythologies that have grown up around it since then. So before we get started, though, can I ask everybody to be sure to like and share the stream, and then we will get into the business at hand. And the business at hand is, of course, dealing with this, one of the cornerstones of anti-communist mythology. In fact, I may even add this program to the anti-communism series. So first prize to anybody in the chat who can put in a brief summary of the things that they were told or that they absorbed via osmosis about what the Prague Spring was actually supposed to be, from the point of view of the story that is told in the West. Notice that they put the word spring onto various operations which the Western intelligence services were involved in, for instance, the Arab Spring. See, what I grew up learning, or shall we say being propagandized about, was that this heroic individual called Alexander Dubcek, who came up through the Czech Communist Party, but he wanted to give socialism a humane face, whatever that means. And whenever anybody says that, it's time to start looking at them as a counter-revolutionary, because that's the usual total gibberish which somebody who it plans to restore capitalism comes out with just before they do that. There's a lot in Dubcek and Dubcek, the other leader who was associated with this. There's a lot in their messaging that was very much repeated and added to by Gorbachev later on. So the story that you are told, that we are all told in the West, is that these heroic few Czech leaders wanted to introduce more democracy and so-called civil liberties. We'll get into what that means later, and were brutally crushed by the invading, horrendous Soviets who imposed a horrible regime on the poor Czechs for another 20 years. They never really specify what that horrible regime was, by the way. Now, that's the cartoon story, and that's the story we were actually taught in first year of undergraduate studies on Soviet and Russian politics. So this very bland, very short on detail, very ahistorical form of the story of what happened in 1968 in Czechoslovakia is told to us. Now, what actually happened is something different. So let's first of all start with what was actually going on, and then we'll get into where this all came from. Now, Alexander Dubcek had been in the Czech Communist Party for a long time, since the period immediately after World War II. And he was selected as the new General Secretary and came into office in January of 1968. And the period that he was in office was 8 months, January to August 1968. And he immediately begins to attempt to dismantle the power of the Communist Party over the state apparatus, and also to dismantle the planned economy as it existed in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Dubcek, who was behind the so-called economic reforms that Dubcek was pushing, which, by the way, the economic side of this was actually highlighted by Dubcek as important as his political reforms. But the economic side of it is almost never mentioned by certainly the leftists who weep crocodile tears about the Prague Spring, and not even many of the out-and-out reactionaries. what they mention is, oh, they wanted freedom and democracy, two words which, unless you analyze what class is enjoying those freedoms, are completely and utterly devoid of meaning. Democracy is devoid of meaning unless you actually are understanding democracy, as Lenin said, for whom? Freedom for whom? Freedom to do what? Or freedom from what? Those words on their own are nothing. They're meaningless. They're emotional triggers designed to silence your thought processes, especially when it comes to something like this. So Dubcek, from the very beginning of his time in office, sought to dissolve the power of the Czech Communist Party. And he aimed to do that by merging the Czech Communist Party into the, or should we say, empowering the so-called United Front and disempowering the Czech Communist Party. See, the strange arrangements in the in the people's democracies of Eastern Europe play a role here, because in each of these countries, it wasn't that the communist parties came to power as like the sole governing party of the nation. They played the leading role, but they were in alliance with other parties. So, for instance, in Poland, they were in alliance with like a peasant party, a social democratic party. In East Germany, there was it was like a broad anti-fascist front. So you had the SED, Sozialistische Einheitspartei, SED, Socialist Einheitsparty Deutschland, Socialist Unity Party of Germany. But you also had like a social democratic party. You had like a version of the German Christian Democrats represented in the East German Parliament. These are things which, of course, you're never told in the West, or if you are told them, it's all these parties were just puppets of the communists. You know, the same is true for Hungary. Same is true for Bulgaria. They all had like multi-party systems, but which operated as like a broad front that represented the forces that opposed fascism in those countries during the time of the Nazi occupation. And let us remember that Prague was liberated from Nazi occupation. It was an incredibly horrendous and brutal Nazi occupation of Prague, as it was everywhere else, particularly in the central and east of Europe. But it was also liberated by Czech communist partisans. And it was the communists who played the leading role in all of the resistance movements in Europe. Let's not forget that either. But Dubcek's plan was to essentially, again, he was a real model for Gorbachev, dismantle the power of the Czech Communist Party by giving the political power in the country more to the United Front group, and draining power away from the Communist Party, and also, as I said, starting to dismantle the planned economy that existed in Czechoslovakia, and at the same time allowing the so-called freedom of the press to exist, meaning actively promoting or allowing the active promotion of counter-revolutionary ideologies, meaning those that came in from the West, from the United States, from Britain, from West Germany, and allowing the free transit into Czechoslovakia of agents from West Germany in particular. It was the West German border that was opened, and controls were released from it, allowing the free movement of many different agents of West Germany and the United States in particular into Czechoslovakia. This created, or started to create, an escalating crisis inside Czechoslovakia, because there were, of course, some particularly in what's now the Czech Republic, and particularly around Prague, so-called intellectuals, etc., who supported this process. And it was a process that those involved understood was not about strengthening socialism. It was about full capitalist restoration. That's what was actually going on. So in Prague, this had a certain degree of support. In the working class and peasant areas of the country, it very much did not. And the resistance was particularly high to the Dubcek so-called reforms in what's now Slovakia, which is interesting, the way that this is played out, because the Czech Republic is a absolute fountainhead of reaction in Eastern Europe now, whereas Slovakia, despite the fact that it's gone through different governments, has consistently shown more resistance to imposition of imperialist edicts. And it elected, of course, most recently Fico, who was nearly killed by a man who had been essentially, it has been shown, on the payroll of Western intelligence services since the early 1980s. Funny that. So the working class and poor peasant areas of Czechoslovakia opposed what Dubcek was doing. The intelligentsia and the petty bourgeois elements, many of them were on board with it. So you had a split society, and the process of the so-called Dubcek reforms played out between January and August 1968, and the eventual intervention came when it became obvious that what Dubcek was doing was essentially undermining the basis for the continuation of the socialist state, such as it was in Czechoslovakia, that existed in 1968. And so and he was doing this by systematically emasculating the Communist Party, by allowing he and his collaborators allowing the unlimited flow of Western agents into Czechoslovakia. They in fact found Western, German, and American ammunition in the basement of government buildings, meaning that what these guys were doing, who Dubcek was allowing to flood into the country, was essentially preparing armed reactionary bands for a rising that would have been similar to Hungary in 1956. Only the planners in West Germany and the United States would have hoped more violent and more successful. So by allowing this uninterrupted flow of people into the country, and again, Dubcek wasn't a stupid man. He knew what he was doing. He was preparing the ground for a full-scale uprising to essentially restore capitalism. That's what the plan was. And again, Dubcek later admitted that this was exactly what they were planning to do. And so we get to the August 1968, and we get to the intervention of the Warsaw Pact forces. It wasn't just the Soviet Union. There was also forces there, I believe, from the DDR, from Poland, and from Hungary as well. And it came as the result of a request from the those on the Czech Communist Party Central Committee who opposed Dubcek. There was also those in the Czech Parliament, and it had strong support from, as I said, particularly the Slovakian peasantry and the poorer working class, who could tell that they were about to get stiffed by the restoration of capitalism. And so when the Soviet army and the Warsaw Pact forces rolled into Prague in 1968, the actual number of casualties was fairly minimal, because they actually acted before the point was reached where the West Germans and the Americans could have staged a Hungary 56 type event, which is where you have an armed uprising, where you force the Soviet army to fight through and basically take Prague by force. They actually acted before things got to that point. And so they prevented what would have probably been at least, at best, a repetition of Hungary 1956, but also would have almost guaranteed a civil war in Czechoslovakia between what's now the Czech Republic and what's now Slovakia. And the fact that they were able to act before that actually shows that there was some foresight on behalf of those who requested that support. So a small correction: the Warsaw Pact forces were from Soviet Union, Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary. East Germany did not directly intervene, because as somebody said in the comments, but it would have looked bad if German troops had been going over the border. But it was providing logistics and other forms of support to the Warsaw Pact forces. So it was in a non-combat role. Now, the mythology will have you believe that this stamped out the progress of socialism with a humane face. But as we've already said, Dubcek's plan and Ota Six's plan was to move to capitalist restoration, and they were using the same methods that Gorbachev would use later on. So what was actually going on? Because there was a series of responses to the Warsaw Pact intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Now, some of which were correct in their analysis, and some of which were wildly wrong. Come to the one that was wildly wrong first. Enver Hoxha was wildly wrong about this intervention. In his analysis, he correctly accused the Soviet leaders of being on the same revisionist path as Dubcek. That's correct, but then incorrectly analyzed it as an expression of Soviet imperialism, which was not a thing that actually existed. This was a completely ridiculous ultra-left concept that came from Maoist era China and also Hoxhaist era Albania. The actual reality was that the most strongly pro-capitalist elements in the Soviet Union were not in favor of intervention in Prague in 1968. The intervention again had been requested by Czech communists themselves, but had been approved by the Soviet political bureau against much opposition, apparently, from like the more pro-capitalist elements there. The pro-capitalist elements didn't want any intervention on behalf of revolutionary forces at all. They wanted to essentially do what Gorbachev did, which was subordinate themselves to the United States. So Hoxha's case that the intervention was designed to basically support the privileges of the Soviet bureaucracy, whilst there might be something to that in terms of like the Soviet bureaucracy, of course, looks to always safeguard its position. It is wrong to suggest, or state as Hoxha did, that this was a product of Soviet social imperialism. The most pro-capitalist elements within the Soviet system did not want to do this. They did not want to do this because what it was doing was getting in the way of what they actually wanted, which is long-term collaboration with US imperialism. So Hoxha got that one completely and utterly wrong, as he got increasingly a lot of things wrong towards the end, towards the later years of his life. He got quite a few things right as well, it must be said. But his judgment regarding the Soviet Union was off, to say the least. Also getting it wrong was Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu rejected Soviet intervention into Czechoslovakia in 1968 and made a big show of making himself an independent, supposedly, leader, but one that still nominally existed within the Warsaw Pact. This, of course, led him to invite Nixon on a state visit to Romania and also take significantly large loans from the IMF. He wasn't the only one who did that, though. It's the bitter ironies of history, though, do always play out. And by 1988 to 89, Ceausescu is the one denouncing Gorbachev as a sellout, a revisionist, and a traitor. And it is Ceausescu who gets destroyed via internal treachery and also external treachery from Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership. But at the time, he denounced the intervention into Czechoslovakia. Now, approving of it was Fidel Castro, who made the argument in a televised speech to the Cuban people that it was legitimate to intervene for friendly armed forces to intervene to defend socialism. And he pointed out in this speech that one of the things that the Czech government was doing under Dubcek's and Six's direction was to take loans from like the German Federal Republic or West Germany and the United States. And this was going together with a lot of other reactionary trends that Dubcek was ushering in that could no doubt be leading only to one place, which is the full restoration of capitalism. See, another thing that Can Castro points this out in his piece, Dubcek was doing was restoring the undeservedly restoring the reputations of the interwar Czech leadership, who were spectacularly useless and led the country to disaster. Just in the same way that the Gorbachev era saw the restoration of the reputations of counter-revolutionaries in the USSR. Now, the other leader who analysed this, both at the time and later, was of course Kim Il-sung of the DPRK, and he said in a later statement that we'll sort of use to sort of segue here. And when being interviewed in 1991, I think, just after the collapse of full collapse of like the people's democracies, he says the incidents in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia should have been a warning. And he said the leaders of the East European countries should have learned a serious lesson from the incidents and made arrangements for the revolutionary education of the people, but they didn't do anything but sat with folded arms. Worse still, they giving themselves up to the imperialist anti-socialist ideological campaign, endorsed the ideological liberty and finally came to see the downfall of their parties and socialism. He continued to say, you can win the fierce confrontation with the imperialists when you adhere to your ideology, but not if you give it up. This is a bloody lesson left by the international communist movement. And he went on to say, my country is small but strong. Though small, the pepper is very hot. The Americans want to munch us, but dare not do so because we are hot. Even a small country will be as hot as the pepper when it is ideologically perfect and sound. It'll then be undaunted over any imperialist challenges. My country is small, but as hot as the pepper. Now, the message there from Kim Il-sung should be one that everyone bears in mind, because the reason for there's the two primary reasons, I should say, for the events in Czechoslovakia in 1968 related directly to revisionism itself and the ability of a Dubcek figure and later a Gorbachev figure to sort of cloak themselves in slogans of increased socialist democracy came about because of the errors and the crimes of revisionism. Now, from 56, of course, at least, judging if we go off the date of Khrushchev's so-called secret speech, though of course it was a speech that was linked to the imperialist press. What that signaled was the abandonment of the revolutionary course and the seeking of compromise or some kind of bargain with imperialism. That's what the Khrushchev leadership wanted, and we've explained before about why that was. The Khrushchevite revisionist clique was based on the most privileged layers of the bureaucracy, who wanted, above everything else, to preserve their privileges by reaching a deal with imperialism. That's what the most reactionary of them wanted to do. And that was what Khrushchev's speech was meant to start. It was meant to be a signal coming from the leaders of the Soviet Union that they were prepared to essentially give up the revolutionary struggles in return for being essentially left alone by imperialism. Now, imperialism has no interest in that deal. Imperialism only has the interest in breaking down all barriers to the export of capital and the exploitation of labor and resources and markets. Or the creation of new markets where ones don't exist. And they can't have over a third of the world sealed off to them, which is what the socialist bloc was doing. So Khrushchev and co. were seeking a deal where none existed. So the consequences of this, though, the consequences in particular of Khrushchev's character assassination of Stalin led to the ushering in of a wave of the ushering in of like a wave of counter-revolutionary thought inside the Eastern Bloc, and this resulted in in all kinds of like deviations from Marxism and all kinds of demoralization. The way in which this unfolded inside the Soviet Union can be spelt out by some of the counter-revolutionaries themselves. So, for instance, Eduard Shevardnadze, later arch traitor and foreign minister for Gorbachev, said that the impact that the secret speech had on him was to completely disillusion him about socialism. You see that for all the problems that did exist in the Soviet Union in the revolutionary period, there was overall a push towards socialism for as long as Stalin and the revolutionaries had influence. Yes, the counter-revolutionaries, the hidden counter-revolutionaries and the bureaucrats were there, the revisionists were there, but they didn't properly and fully gain power until after the death of Stalin. Now, their aim was to essentially disempower the working class and secure permanent rule for themselves. And this, again, is the reason why they wanted to destroy the revolution, the reputation of the revolutionary period, which is awkward to do because their legitimacy, Khrushchev's legitimacy, was based on the fact that he had been a senior official in the very period he was now denouncing, which led to all kinds of contradictions. Anyway, Khrushchev's leadership led to many twists and turns, and ultimately he was deposed later on in 1964, and he was deposed by a group that is led by Brezhnev, but by no means only consists of him. Now, the coalition that got rid of Khrushchev had various different facets to it. It had the revisionist, arch revisionists in it, but it also had those who were opposed to the path that Khrushchev had been on, or one of the many paths that Khrushchev had been on, which is towards the restoration of more capitalist norms in production and distribution of commodities. And so the Brezhnev period represents this strange hybrid, where on the one hand you have revolutionaries in the Soviet Union pushing back against pushing back against imperialism and aiding revolutionary forces. So like in Vietnam, for instance, in Laos, in some of the African nations, the Soviet Union was actually actively aiding national liberation movements in a way that the comprador types definitely didn't want, and also was building up a significant military force that the United States couldn't hope to win against, particularly with the advances in Soviet nuclear missile technology, all of which the US found that they couldn't compete with, so started asking for arms control treaties. So that on that side of things, you have a strengthening of like the ability of the Soviet Union to defend itself and the ability of the Soviet Union to deter the United States. On the other side of it, you have the slow progress towards restoration of capitalist production norms. That includes things like the depoliticization of the working class, or the attempted depoliticization of the working class, the introduction of monetary bonuses for hitting production targets, the giving of more freedom to management in individual factories to pursue their own agendas, the increased levels of corruption that came from that, starting at the emergence of like a shadow bourgeoisie underground in the Soviet Union. All of this started to expand under Brezhnev. So on the one hand, you have some positive elements of the Brezhnev legacy, including more taking in a role of actively defending the Arab states against the aggression of the US and its Israeli puppet state. But on the other hand, you have things like the push to sign the Helsinki Accords, which was all about actually allowing the most rabid pro-capitalist elements in the CPSU to pursue their dream of partnership with US imperialism, and allowing US and British imperialist so-called human rights organizations to get into the Warsaw Pact states and indeed the Soviet Union itself, and elevate dramatically the position of so-called dissidents like Sakharov or other wretched fascistic individuals like Solzhenitsyn. These people's fame was elevated far above what it ever deserved to be by their association with these Western so-called human rights organizations. Now, how does this relate back to what happened in Prague in 1968? Now, what happens in Prague in 1968, again, it was a reflection of real problems in the system as represented by Czech socialism at the time. In the reason why Dubcek and his talk about democratization caught on at all was because that the Czech party was too heavily bureaucratic. That's the thing. It was getting distanced and divorced from the masses. And when that happens, it gives the opportunity for demagogic figures to step forward and claim to be able to combine socialism and democracy, or make socialism with a humane face, or whatever else that they want to say at the time. Now, Khrushchev claimed that he was addressing these problems, or addressing problems of failures in the building of socialism in the USSR by making his wretched speech in 1956. But that isn't, of course, how you deal with internal problems in a socialist country. What you should do, and this is what, of course, the Soviet revisionists didn't do, was if you want to identify where an error has been made, then that debate should be had openly via party mechanisms. It should be spelt out to the working class where an error has been made and why, not just in terms of scapegoating, but also in terms of raising the political level of the working class so that they understand the error that has been made, so that workers can resist it if this error is made again. Now, what you don't do is go and immediately start traducing the system, the history of the revolutionary struggles, and the revolutionary leadership of the past. That's only designed to promote nihilism and a collapse in faith in the system and the promotion of counter-revolutionary trends. It is that which is what Dubcek was doing. He was allowing the propaganda from the US and the West Germans to grow inside Czechoslovakia to the point where it became the fact that the reactionaries had almost unrestricted access to the airwaves of Czechoslovakia, broadcasting like pure anti-communist propaganda. Again, this is a method that Gorbachev would use 20 years later, which is that in order to get full capitalist restoration, you have to destroy the Soviet. You have to destroy the Communist Party, because even when a Communist Party, like the Soviet Party was compromised by a revisionist leadership, had become overly bureaucratized, it still is able to call upon the allegiance of millions upon millions of workers. It's still able to mobilize millions of workers in defense of the revolution, if that was what the leadership wanted to do. And the mere fact that you have millions of workers organized inside a communist party, however flawed it is, and the Communist Party's obligated to defend the socialist system, means that you essentially have to, if you're a counter-revolutionary like Gorbachev or Yakovlev or Dubcek, you have to destroy the Communist Party at its roots. You have to remove it from power and then suppress it, which is what the plan was in the USSR. It's what Dubcek was planning to do, I think, inside the Czech Republic. Now, to turn to the question which the Trots and the reformists and etc. will scream about at this stage, which is, oh, they just wanted civil liberties. Well, again, let's ask a question. Liberties for who? The only liberties that Dubcek was really promoting was the liberty for capital to come in and restore capitalist relations of production. just as that was the main thing that Gorbachev was for. And also, to say that you want freedom of speech based on what Western models, well, under the various models that exist in the West, freedom of speech essentially doesn't exist and never really did. You're free to say whatever you like in America or Britain or France, as long as it doesn't actually make any difference. You're free to say the end times are coming. You're free to say that a man can be a woman by wishing it was so. You're free to say that there's the rulers are all lizards in man costumes and stuff like that. You're not free to mass communicate to the working class in a way that could pose a threat to the system. You're not free to do that. You're not free to do what Julian Assange did and WikiLeaks did, which was reveal the secrets of the bourgeoisie in Britain and the United States. You're not free to do that. You're not free under capitalism to do anything which could bring into question the dominance of the capitalist class over the means of production. You're not free to do that. You will get suppressed. You will get arrested. You will get stitched up. You will get thrown in jail. Why is it then that that of course bourgeois ideologists will scream and yell about freedom of speech inside what was then Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries? But of course, they'll never apply any of this to themselves. It's just they just assume the more should we say honestly deluded of them, that they have pure freedom of speech in the West because they say so, and that therefore everything they do must be democratic. But you need to examine what was the situation regarding actual freedom of speech, even in the late period Soviet Union. See, the better Soviet leaders, including, I would argue, people like Andropov, realized that they did need to increase the visibility and comprehensibility of the system to the working class, which is why in the Andropov era, they started printing full reports from Central Committee meetings and other senior government and party meetings. Reports started to be published in Pravda and elsewhere, because what the aim was there was to build accountability via the existing system, by increasing the working class's awareness of what was going on. When you want, and also it must be said that in the Soviet media, there was much more criticism of the system than is generally acknowledged. Even in the Brezhnev era, it was there were reports about failed factory production targets, corrupt officials, etc., that were routinely run in the Soviet press. So it's not true, as the bourgeois ideologists and their collaborators say, that there was no freedom of speech in the Soviet Union. This just simply isn't correct. There was freedom for the media to criticize certain party officials. Corruption cases did get reported on. Now, was the level of political education and organization of the proletariat what we would have wanted? No. But what Dubcek was aiming to do was to, by talking in this sort of fluffy language about freedom of speech and democracy, what he was actually aiming to do was to hollow out the Czech, or the Czechoslovak, I should say, Communist Party, and to terminally weaken it to the point where it couldn't mobilize the working class in resistance to the restoration of capitalism. And again, this is something that Gorbachev learned, or who Gorbachev's handlers learned from, and learned that they needed to move much quicker and much more decisively in the Soviet Union to dismantle things, which is what the plans of all of these so-called Democrats all amounted to in the end. Now, ultimately, I think that we should defend what's known as the Prague Spring as an example of the defense of a revolution, the defense of the interests of the Czech working class, because we can prove that point, because look what happened to the interests of the Czech and Slovak working classes after 1991. Both of them have been under siege and have been being reduced, their standards of living being reduced, their industry being destroyed, their economy asset stripped by predators from Germany, France, Britain, and the United States. The Czech Republic has no sovereignty. It's just a slave of Berlin and Washington. It's a joke of a government. ruling over a nation that's just basically been turned into a tourist trap. And now they're looking to ban Marxist parties from even running. So this is what happened when the reformers got their way, and when it was the result was an unremitting war upon the Czech working class, which lost all of the achievements of socialism by the mid-1990s. Interestingly enough, as I said earlier, the resistance in Slovakia went on longer, and is to a certain extent still there. But in terms of the Czech working class, they have been the big losers when eventually Dubcek returned, along with the counter-revolutionaries and the Charter 77 organization and others who finally managed to restore capitalism in Czechoslovakia. Again, look at the results. It is a social and economic disaster for the Czech working class. So the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the crushing of Dubcek's counter-revolutionary clique, is something that is actually a positive thing. It is something which should be regarded positively, because but the downside is that whilst it did crush a counter-revolutionary clique, it did nothing to remove the other counter-revolutionary cliques that were growing in power across the Warsaw Pact, including in the Soviet Union itself. And that's the real tragedy here, that whereas you remove the Dubcek clique, you don't do anything to remove the conditions which allowed them to come into power in the first place. And in fact, those conditions only grew and grew to the point where by the end of the 80s, Gorbachev is collaborating with the CIA to dispose of Ceausescu. And that's the real tragedy, that the lessons, as Kim Il-sung notes, were not learned. And in fact, the opposite lessons were taken by the most reactionary elements in the Soviet Union, which is that they need to drive harder and more ruthlessly to destroy the CPSU itself in order to get what they wanted. Community Snideline says Václav Havel was a big fan of the Bee Gees. Well, it just goes to show that the man had no talent and no taste, as well as having the politics of a garden variety fascist. Right. Let's say hello to those who are in the chat. Hello to Robeson. Hello to Sid, Enigma, Walter, Comrade Daniel, Jerry, Caustic Grip, Patrick, Anthony, Welch, Rentier Oligarch, Nicole from Ireland, Working Prole Incorporated, Luton 92, James Graham, Community Snidelines, Tom Wolfe says, greetings from a Union flag strewn England. The butcher's apron is everywhere. Well, that's one of the advantages of living in Scotland. You don't see it very often. It's probably a deliberate policy on behalf of the government, trying desperately to promote militarism in England by sticking the butcher's apron everywhere. I doubt it'll work, though, to be completely honest, because you can stick the flag everywhere, but if you can't back it up with material changes, which they can't, it won't count for much. Hello to President Jesus. Hello to Comrade Jawad. Hello to Jenny, Comrade Moderator. Hello to Lee. Hello to Jace Hart. Hello to Ian Foster. Leo Messi, not that one, I don't think. I don't think he'd be here. Gillian C says, my mum told me Dubcek was a great guy in the future of European values. If by European values you mean remorseless war on the working class, then I guess your mum was right. Hello to Cherry Cupcake, James Goblin, coming to us from the once and future capital of the socialist Yugoslavia. Hello to Almir, Slovenia, another part of the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Rentier Oligarch says, how does what is now the Orban faction relate to these counter-revolutions? Well, they celebrate them, which is funny because Orban is now getting to the point where he's tying himself up in knots, because all of the forces that he used to work with, EU, US, Soros, etc., are now placing him under siege because he's done a couple of very basic things about reasserting Hungarian sovereignty. And they can't wait to get rid of him, which must be confusing for him. So, hello to RVA Klavek. Sid says, Yes, indeed. After the partisan murder of Reinhard Heydrich via the aid of British intelligence in May 1942, the Waffen SS crackdown on Prague was exceptionally brutal. Indeed, it was. Tom Wolfe correctly points out, one of the first things Dubcek did was to disarm the workers' militia. This rang the alarm bells in Moscow. Yes, indeed. And one of the things that the so-called reformists always do is to get rid of any source of power that could prevent them doing what they want to do, which is to fully restore capitalism. So you need to disarm the working class, both literally and ideologically. And so this is, of course, one of the reasons why the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela survives, is because Chavez and then Maduro made sure that the working class was trained and held arms. And remain armed at all and organized to resist any potential counter-revolutionary invasion. The disarming of the workers' militia is key to understanding what Dubcek was really about and why he has hymns sung in his praise at the Church of Capitalism. Hello to Anthony, who joins us appropriately enough from Prague. Sid says Hungary 1956, another BND operation, meaning BND, the West German Secret Service, which was, of course, founded by fascists after World War II. Hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby. Almir, to answer your question, the Chinese denounced the invasion as an act of Soviet social imperialism, because the Chinese were on a strange ultra-left binge at the time, which ultimately turned into a right-wing one, as it always does. Sid says, Kim Il-sung was alluding to fissures in your front line, which can only allow your mortal enemy access to your underbelly, need to be avoided if possible. Yes, the point that all the leaders of the DPRK have made is that you must not give your enemy access to your state. And that includes keeping out their fucking NGOs, which are just intelligence operations, blocking their radio channels, censoring the information they try and the misinformation they try and broadcast into your country, because the imperialists are very clear that, like, no matter what amount of groveling that the Eastern Bloc leaders and the Soviet leaders did, the aim that the imperialists had was still the destruction of those systems. And a revolutionary leadership that really is a revolutionary leadership should take all measures possible to, including banning foreign organizations, deporting people, not allowing people into the country who are known counter-revolutionaries and who are known intelligence assets, and basically doing that as the DPRK leadership does, and then just facing down the screams and protests that come from the Americans and the British. Basically just turning around and saying, see, we're only angry because we found their agents. Rista Costadino says, I love Ceausescu independent policy, shaking hands with everybody like fascist, libs, communists. Yeah, didn't do him much good in the end, though. Didn't do him much good in the end. Have I done one about Poland? No, that's on the list. The Polish People's Republic is a very tragic story of one mistake after another after another. It's, to be honest, when you start reading about the Polish People's Republic, it's a miracle that it made it to 1989. The leadership was that all over the place. Gillian C says, the fact that Queen Elizabeth hated Ceausescu more than any other leader made me warm to him a lot. Well, I mean, in fairness to Ceausescu, man made a lot of mistakes, but he never gave up on the idea of progressing to socialism for all his mistakes, which is why ultimately he was killed. He remained committed to the socialist system, and that's why the Gorbachevites collaborated with the CIA and the West Germans to have him taken out. Sid Atfield says, all of the folly of revisionism gave fertile ground for Trotskyists to later refer to the Soviet leadership as a gangster trade union bureaucracy without being too far off the mark. Well, they became that, especially with especially I would argue it really truly became that with the Gorbachevites. That was when they actually started behaving in that fashion, in a full and unrestrained way. Sid says freedom to speech, meaning freedom to say or believe anything, but freedom to know nothing, which is a good way of putting it in actual fact. Daniel says even George Lucas had to confess one time that filmmakers in the US had more freedom of speech than any filmmaker in Hollywood. Well, yes, because even though you were restricted in your ability to criticize the party and the state, you weren't restricted in terms of content otherwise. And this is what Lucas said in an interview with Charlie Rose. It must be over a decade ago now, because Charlie Rose was still on TV. But he regarded the Soviet filmmakers as being much more free to in their creativity than anyone working in Hollywood, because Hollywood filmmakers, or filmmakers in any capitalist country really, but particularly Hollywood, you have to go to a producer, and a producer can instantly just say, no, we're not doing that, or take that out, or put that in. Like, there's loads of censorship in Hollywood movies, some of which is directly done by the American state itself, the more of which is done by producers, just saying no to that, no to that, no to that. So the writers and directors' vision very rarely actually makes it onto the screen without very significant changes. Nectarios or Fanudakis says the so-called Prague Spring split the Greek Communist Party in two while they were in the concentration camps of a CIA-backed fascist dictatorship. Yeah. Well, the correct analysis was out there from the DPRK and to a certain extent from the Cuban leadership. But a lot of the, particularly the Western influenced communist parties, split over it. And the pro-Dubcek splits all ended up being like Euro-communists or social democrats of some description. Havel's really had a personal friendship with Frank Zappa. Well, he goes to show you. By your friends shall ye be known. Rock and roll music, by the way, in the West, all of it is essentially a creation of degenerating capitalism. It's like when the ultra reactionaries in the United States said that rock and roll is a sign of a disintegrating society that promotes harmful values. In essence, they were right when they said that, but they were the very worst people who could have said it, because they were defending a system which was rotting and disintegrating. And their promotion of so-called family values is nothing more than base hypocrisy, because American conservatives, more than anything else, more than they love God, more than they love their church, love private property over and above everything else. So their criticism of American culture, whilst containing elements of truth in it, was valueless because it came from people whose the very essence of them supports societal disintegration and rot. However, one needs to come face to face with the facts, which is that American culture, British culture, etc., particularly after World War II, was wholly rotten and counter-revolutionary in its content, and was used to promote very damaging antisocial behavior patterns, especially in young people. And I speak as somebody who was probably influenced by this myself. And you need to understand that everything that was fed to us as culture was designed to promote nihilism, to promote inertia, to promote elevation of selfish individualistic desires over and above everything else, to channel our emotions and our creativity towards what? Driving cars, getting laid, smoking, drinking, doing narcotics to excess. Those are the things that this culture promotes, even while hypocritically pretending that it doesn't. That's the thing that all of the music that we listen to as kids promoted to us. And therefore, it's not a surprise that the CIA and others and MI6 promoted this kind of culture assiduously within the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, because it's socially rotten. That's the thing. It is a rotten, disgusting culture, something that promotes like alcoholism, drug taking, and treating women as objects to be conquered. That's not a healthy culture. That's a rotten one. The West is rotten and has been for a very, very long time. And until we manage to reject the things that are given to us by the bourgeois culture, reject all of it as rancid, all of it is poison, and just push it into the bin, then we're going to be fighting this struggle with one arm tied behind our backs, because we need to realize that the culture we were born into is rotten. Bit off topic there, but I think it needed saying. Anthony says, I heard a few older Czechs expressing regrets, as usually understandably economic, but younger people too. Yeah, well, if you look at what's been done to the Czech Republic now, a truncated state ruled over by petty and corrupt reactionaries that is completely deindustrialized, that lost many of the achievements of the socialist period. There's no other conclusion you can draw, unless you're a bourgeois who's doing well out of this, that this is the 1989, the Velvet counter-revolution was an absolute, total, utter disaster. And the counter-revolutions, by the way, always come about because of a collaboration, the collaboration between the most rotten revisionist elements who turn pro-capitalist, the so-called dissidents inside the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, for instance, inside any socialist country, and the imperialists. So there is the internal collapse, which is brought about by the leaders who represent like the end state of revisionism. The end of revisionism is always capitalist restorationism. It's always that. That's where it always ends up, unless it's actively and harshly struggled against, in a real sense. I mean, actively engaging the workers in the struggle. Moving on. A.D. Kravitz says, thoughts on the US fascist military being out in the US? Well, I mean, I haven't read enough about it, to be honest. So I need to go back and look at it again, and look at it properly before I can give a verdict on that. But I promise to do something on that in the next few days, because I need to read up on the exact extent of it. But I'm not going to launch into speculation without doing some kind of investigation first. Almir says, in Yugoslavia, there were almost no high-ranking party members trying to mobilize the masses when it was all going to shit. On the other hand, Maduro just mobilized millions in Venezuela to oppose US. Yeah, Maduro is far more of a revolutionary than anybody, any of the leaders of the old Soviet bloc, or the later period Soviet Union itself. There were millions of people in Yugoslavia who identified as Yugoslavs who would have opposed separatism. But what that would have meant was, if you were going to do that, that would have led you on a collision course, not just with the domestic reactionaries in Yugoslavia, of which there were plenty, but there would have been a direct collision course with the imperialists, particularly the Germans and the United States, who were the two big players in Yugoslavia. Now, that's not to say that such a struggle couldn't have been won, but there was nobody in the League of Yugoslav Communists who was capable of doing that kind of thing, because their last capable leaders had died off or been marginalized years ago. The root of the problem lying in Tito's suppression of the revolutionary wing of the old Yugoslav Communist Party in the late 40s, meaning that the people that ended up being promoted were just these weak-source bureaucrats who were terrified of the working class. They were more terrified of the Yugoslav working class actually rallying to defend socialism, because it might threaten their position, than they were of the entire system getting destroyed. And so that's what happened. Even the people in the Soviet Union who opposed Gorbachev were terrified of seeking to mobilize the working class. They were terrified of conflict. They were terrified of conflict with the USA. By the end, the state of the leadership in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia was woeful. You went from a party which was literally led by people prepared to face down the bullets of the reactionaries and die in the knowledge of that their death had been a worthy addition to the revolution, to people who wouldn't sacrifice like a minute's discomfort, an awkward phone call with a US president, who wouldn't sacrifice a single thing to fight to preserve the socialist system. That's what revisionism does. It makes people weak. It promotes theft, pettiness, weakness, cowardice, perfidious behavior of all kinds amongst the leadership, and it promotes depoliticization and weakness amongst the proletariat. There's nothing good to say about revisionism or revisionists. Are there solid books about Poland? Yeah, there's a book by Albert Szymanski on Poland. You can find it on the Internet Archive site. Matthew says, if someone once had very reactionary beliefs but have changed their mind sincerely, could they ever accept them as comrades, and could they be part of a movement? Depends. We all grow up with deeply reactionary beliefs, even those of us who regarded ourselves as leftists or progressives or liberals. So depends. Like, you couldn't accept someone who still maintained fascist beliefs, but somebody who was prepared to read and learn and play their part in the building of a communist party, and again be prepared to engage in continual development of their own intellectual and moral and ethical outlook, then there's no reason why somebody who was once a reactionary couldn't be recruited into a communist party if they're prepared to do those things. Alexander Luchter says, weirdly enough, the Frankfurt School Pope Adorno agreed on that refusal of pop culture. The Neu music he loved is very dry and theory-based audio torture. Never listened to it. I'll have to look that up now. It's also one of the things that Lyndon LaRouche was actually right about. Everybody's got something. Anthony says, there is a colony of homeless drunks at the top of my street, unthinkable in Prague 20 or 30 years ago. Yep, there's the legacy of freedom. Thank you, Václav Havel. Sid says, with reference to Trump, he's militarizing the wealthiest city in the United States and acting like he's making safe a crime-ridden hellhole. The frogs are boiling. I think the frogs boiled a while ago, Sid. Almir says, Milovan Djilas was a great revolutionary and later became a traitor. He supported the Hungarian counter-revolution. Indeed, he did. Yeah, and in the end, as Rista Costadino says, Djilas had become like an ultra-reactionary by the 90s, which is the fate of a lot of these people. Alexander Luchter says, allegedly there is evidence that the US music industry and the private prison industry conspired a bit, promoting violence, glorifying rap. I have heard that before. I'll have to catch up on the reading on it, though. MI6 promoted the Liam Gallagher bowl haircut to prevent teenage boys from getting laid. Well, listen to the lyrics of Oasis. What is working class life according to them? It's taking drugs, getting pissed, trying to get laid. That's it. That's the audio slop that's served up to the working class by British bourgeois-controlled record industries. That's why they love things like Oasis. Because to Oasis's lyrics, and I used to listen to this shit a lot. It's like working class life is just a nihilistic, grim place where like the only joy you get is by taking a narcotic or getting drunk. That's it. That's why like they are the ultimate like 1990s band, because there's no hope of anything ever being better. The only hope in their music is of like a temporary brief release from taking drugs, which is a fucking horrible reactionary nightmare when you actually start to think about it, which is why you're always encouraged not to think about these things. Has anybody ever said to you, can't you just let people enjoy things? Strangely enough, it's been said to me a few times. Did you discuss John Bolton's home being raided by the FBI today? No, that'll be on the next Decline and Fall show, trust me. Caustic Grip says, by the way, try finding an interview with Hedges where he doesn't mention standing next to Havel during the final days of Czechoslovakia. Yeah, well, Hedges is a fucking creep. He's a vile anti-communist buffoon at best. Like the fact that like he constantly harps on about the fall of Yugoslavia and what it means for USA tells me he doesn't understand either the former Yugoslavia or the USA. Like, so, I mean, you don't get to be the New York Times premier foreign correspondent without being a reactionary. And Hedges is he's a reactionary. Yes, he's a reactionary who ultimately fell foul of his own editors because he finally decided that something the US was doing was not justified. But listen to him. He's a classic, like, Cold War liberal, like progressive mumblings over a very hardcore anti-communist belief system, which is what he is. He's a he's as much of an anti-communist as a more honest reactionary, like, you know, Colonel Douglas MacGregor. In fact, him and MacGregor probably share quite a few opinions, even though Hedges, of course, would be loath to admit it. Right. Okay. So 298 of you watching at the moment. I'm going to draw things to a close here for this evening. I think we'll probably return to this question in future episodes. But thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back again with you tomorrow evening at the same time. So please join us then. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. But until then, here's your musical outroduction.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает